On this last Sunday of November, Paul sat all the afternoon on the lowest step of his stoop, staring into the street while his sisters in their rockers were talking to the minister's daughters next door about how many shirtwaists they had made in the last week and how many waffles someone had eaten at the last church supper. When the weather was warm and his father was in particularly jovial frame of mind, the girls made lemonade, which was always brought out in a red glass pitcher, ornamented with forget-me-nots in blue enamel. This the girls thought very fine, and the neighbors joked about the suspicious color of the pitcher. Today, Paul's father on the top step was talking to a young man who shifted a restless baby from knee to knee. He happened to be the young man who was daily held up to Paul as a model, and after whom it was his father's dearest hope that he would pattern. This young man was of a ruddy complexion, with a compressed red mouth and faded nearsighted eyes, over which he wore thick spectacles with gold bows that curved about his ears. He was clerk to one of the magnates of a great steel corporation, and was looked upon in Cordelia Street as a young man with a future. There was a story that some 5 years ago, he was now barely 26, he had been a trifle dissipated, but in order to curb his appetites and save the loss of time and strength that a sowing of wild oats might have entailed, he had taken his chief's advice, oft reiterated to his employees, and at 21 had married the first woman whom he could persuade to share his fortunes. She happened to be an angular schoolmistress, much older than he, who also wore thick glasses, and who had now borne him 4 children, all nearsighted like herself. The young man was relating how his chief, now cruising in the Mediterranean, kept in touch with all the details of the business, arranging his office hours on his yacht just as though he were at home, and knocking off work enough to keep 2 stenographers busy. His father told in turn the plan his corporation was considering of putting in an electric railway plant at Cairo. Paul snapped his teeth. He had an awful apprehension that they might spoil it all before he got there. Yet he rather liked to hear these legends of the Iron Kings that were told and retold on Sundays and holidays, these stories of palaces in Venice, yachts on the Mediterranean, and high play at Monte Carlo appealed to his fancy, and he was interested in the triumphs of cash boys who had become famous, though he had no mind for the cash boy stage. After supper was over and he had helped to dry the dishes, Paul nervously asked his father whether he could go to George's to get some help in his geometry, and still more nervously asked for carfare. This latter request he had to repeat, as his father, on principle, did not like to hear requests for money. Whether much or little, he asked Paul whether he could not go to some boy who lived nearer, and told him that he ought not to leave his schoolwork until Sunday. But he gave him the dime. He was not a poor man, but he had a worthy ambition to come up in the world. His only reason for allowing Paul to usher was that he thought a boy ought to be earning a little. Paul bounded upstairs, scrubbed the greasy odor of the dishwater from his hands with the ill-smelling soap he hated, and then shook over his fingers a few drops of violet water from the bottle he kept hidden in his drawer. He left the house with his geometry conspicuously under his arm, and the moment he got out of Cordelia Street and bounded a downtown car, he shook off the lethargy of 2 deadening days and began to live again. To be continued.